good evening, and welcome. Dun-dun-dun-dun-dun.
Hello.
Hello, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
Okay, Rob, what do you want to talk about tonight, Robert?
Well, you asked me to find something to talk about, and so I gave it some thought, and I thought, aha, I know what to talk about. I did post about it this week as well. It's something I've been thinking about for a while, and it is highly relevant to the current situation that we're seeing, not least for the COP26 thing, for example, that we're seeing, and that is something called post-modernism. Now, people are going to say, what? What's that? People say, what's he talking about now? Actually, it's all there for you to see. And it's actually, in terms of politics and philosophy, it's quite well known. So you say, what is postmodernism? Well, what I'm suggesting to you is, or to everybody, is that in fact politics has indeed changed. So there has been a change in politics, and it's a relatively big one, and that is the rise of what we would now call postmodernism, and has been called postmodernism since the 80s. And I first heard about it in the 80s. I mean, I just read a lot, and I'm quite interested in architecture. And some of you will realise and have noticed that there are a sudden rise of what I like to call the curly whirly buildings. Do you know what I mean by that, Steve? Those strange shaped buildings.
All right, yeah, yeah.
You see all the funny shapes, instead of being square and they're sideways, and you've got the gherkin and all these
Yes,
funny
yeah.
bendy whatever, and that's an architectural movement. And I mean, I'm very interested in domestic architecture. I know a reasonable amount it, all the different generations that built different houses, and architects being what they are, they have a theory that buildings create the society, right?
Ah,
So that the kind of buildings you live in create the kind of life you lead. Now, why, you would say, are they called postmodernism? Why is it called postmodernism? What's that mean? And that is, you do have to know at least one thing about history, and that is the beginning of the modern age, what we call the modern age. And that started, to keep it simple, that started with Henry VIII. And the period, and the Tudors and the Stuarts, and that's known as the early modern period. And what really brought the modern age to life, or into reality, was the English Civil War. And then finally, when you got James II kicked off the throne, and you got William and Mary, and they had what was called the so-called 1688 Glorious Revolution.
right.
And what you got then was, if you think about it, you started getting square brick-built buildings. In fact, you started getting brick-built buildings, and that's called the modern period. And of course, what it also coincided with was capitalism. In fact, the English Civil War was really the great British capitalist war. And you got the beginning, the real start of shopkeeping, lots of shops, and usually owned by the shopkeepers and small industrial building companies, sort of like blacksmiths, who'd become what we'd now call light engineering. So you've got that is the modern age. And so that's when you got square buildings. And in fact, some of you know the big houses, the big country houses that were built were in fact just square rectangular brick-built buildings. But you could buy from an Italian guy called Palladian. You got a mail order book, and you could stick columns and pillars and all this kind of stuff that make them look like Greek houses and all that. So that was the modern period. And so what you've got now is that in the early 80s, this postmodernism came along. So instead of having these all square buildings, they started building what I like to call curly whirly buildings. The most famous guy perhaps is Gaudi, who built that bizarre cathedral in Spain, some of you, and I think it was the Museum of Modern Art, I think it was, that was built with all pearls on it, and then and that is the post-modern design of architecture. Now, so when capitalism developed during the 1500s and the 1600s and the 1700s, by the 1800s, there was a kind of counterforce to it. And that was what we had first was communism, there were the levelers before that, but you've got the Chartists, and then you've got Marxism, and then what was known as socialism. It came under the rubric of socialism and the Labour Party and that. And they were basically opposing all this kind of the wealth creation that capitalism enabled. And of course, the Industrial Revolution and all that. So you've got lots of mass production and all the kind of stuff we all, that we now associate with modern life. And so, but by the mid-1970s, that kind of period, it was obvious that socialism wasn't working. And in fact, when I was a kid, if you wanted to get on in the academic world, you had to admit to being a Marxist. Even if you weren't, you had to say you were a Marxist if you wanted to get on. It was just the way that it was. And the theory about Marxism is that, and you'll hear it now about, I'll come to this in a minute, but all this racism and all this kind of stuff is that society and white privilege is that society creates white privilege. Society, there are structures that are built within society that lead us to be the kinds of people we are. Now, of course, it's totally patronizing by these sort of theorists that they think that everybody's stupid and they don't know what kind of person they are and all that kind of stuff. But this was the theory. And when Marxism became unpopular, they in fact looked at this theory in architecture about postmodernism, and that's what happened, is that they started calling themselves postmodernists. And what came along with all this postmodernism was what we would now call the Green Movement. And all the other movements you can think of. I mean, in fact, to keep it reasonably concise, if you like, you've got BLM that has emerged recently. All the racism stuff, even the gender and sex identification thing that's going on. So what you're getting is that in opposition to the capitalist movement, which is conservatives, Republicans, those kinds of people, as Labour and the socialist movement, obviously, I mean, everyone knows that there's no country in the world, or should know, there's no country in the world that was socialist that's ever succeeded. Socialism doesn't work, whether they like it or they don't like it, but it's true. And so what replaced it was this theory called modernism. And what you have in this theory of modernism is critical thinking. It's a whole critical theory. It's a whole part of it. You can look it up. It's on Wikipedia. And so what you started seeing, and I noticed it at the time in the 80s, I think Channel 4 was the first proponent of postmodernism, is that they're just starting to attack everything, including the Union Jack, I think, if I look back on what was going on, started attacking everything about traditional British and even English society, really. So now, to keep it short, as I say, we've got attacks on statues, attacks on imperialism, decolonizing history, this whole concept of gender fluidity, and obviously the Green Movement. So the Green Movement, BLM, post-Labour, post-socialist, post-Marxist. But when you cut away at it, when you interrogate the theory, what do you come at the bottom of it is that they're all anti-capitalist. If you look at BLM, and I mean, Black Lives do matter, I've got no problem with that. But if you look into the actual organization itself, it's anti-capitalist. The Green Movement, now, of course, very few people actually vote for the Greens. They would deny that and say it's the electoral system, that people don't vote for the Greens. But when you look at what the Greens actually think, they're actually anti-capitalist. And in fact, they want to change everything about the life that we've led. White men in particular, the patriarchy, that's another one that they love to talk about. So this whole structure, patriarchy, sexism, capitalism, all these stuff have come to create the horrible, I don't think it's horrible, but this grouping that has merged into this idea of postmodernism, so that the society that we had that was imperialist and colonial and patriarchal and fossil fuel using and all this kind of thing came about because of modernism. And so, in fact, the Marxists and the socialists and that crowd have adopted postmodernism as a kind of disguise. So they don't say they're Marxists anymore. They just say they're postmodernists or Greens. And so the left, as it would be called, has become the postmodernist grouping. And that's, and particularly when you see now that, you know, this idea of climate change, which I mean, I completely dispute that man could possibly change the climate. For those of you that don't know, in the last 500,000 years, we've had 5 periods of climate change. The last one was 8,000 years ago, and humans were living in the UK at the time. So climate change is just a natural event. It happens from time to time. But what the postmodernists are using these things for is an attempt to attack what they perceive as a, you know, I don't know whether, you know, a horrible, nasty system, which basically capitalism is responsible for. And I'm saying that that's not true. You can use a very simple method of working that out, is that there's, in philosophy, there's a system called, and wait for it, reductio ad absurdum. That means reducing to the ridiculous, taking things to a ridiculous point. So that's, and why you use that is to see whether a theory or an assertion is true. So if we stopped capitalism tomorrow, if we said, right, that's enough, no more capitalism, we're just going to stop it, what would happen? Well, there'd be chaos. Capitalism would be ending all shopkeeping and the closing of all small businesses. Officially, it's 250, but I would think it was nearer 100. But just closing all small businesses. Would that make life better? No, it most certainly wouldn't. The same applies to fossil fuels. Okay, let's just say it is all fossil fuels. We stop using fossil fuels tomorrow. Would that make life better? I think not. But if you use, I mean, there may be other factors regarding capitalism and fossil fuels that aren't brilliant, but it isn't the use of fossil fuels in capitalism itself, it's other factors. But what other factors could we talk about? Well, let's say we cancelled, and that's another thing, the cancel culture, which I'm sure everyone's heard about. Let's cancel postmodernism tomorrow and all the people that associate themselves. Let's cancel postmodernism tomorrow. What would happen? Nothing. All that would happen was that the TV stations, the news stations in particular, would have a lot fewer ridiculous stories for their programs. Because the news, if you listen to it, and I know lots of people don't, I mean, I'd be the first to admit that, and I know that, but all these stories about gender assignment, fossil fuels, capitalism, all you're getting is a one-sided view. If you take, I mean, and since it's COP26, I thought this is the best time to think about it. What about COP20? What about volcanoes? Now, Ian Stewart is a brilliant geologist. He's got his series on running at the minute. 600 million years ago, the Earth was a snowball. It's called Snowball Earth. It was literally covered in ice 600 million years ago. The reason that it was released from that, I was going to be rhetorical and say, do you know what stopped it? But what stopped it, what warmed up the Earth was volcanoes emitting CO2. That's what warmed the Earth up. So without volcanoes, there'd be no life on Earth. Did you know that all the time, at any one moment in time, 20 or 30 volcanoes are doing their stuff, firing off? But what's more incredible is that 3/4 of all volcanoes are under the sea. So if you think of, if anybody knows about tectonic plates, you know that tectonic plates are moving apart all the time. That's because lava is pouring out of the center from the Earth, forcing the continents apart. I mean, they may not be individual volcanoes, but that's lava. So so apparently the sea is warming. Is anyone surprised? If there are up to 6,000, I can't even work it out. It's too late. But it's thousands. It's thousands of volcanoes under the sea, working all the time. Now, Has anybody mentioned that to you? No.
No.
Some people have mentioned volcanoes on the surface, but they don't know how many volcanoes there are under the sea. Now, nobody's talked about that, have they? Because the whole postmodern thing isn't about getting to the truth about anything. It's about undermining, like chopping all these statues down. It's about undermining the state, undermining Western capitalism, if you want to put it like that. And all these TV news stories about the disaster of climate. How does anybody know there's going to be a catastrophe in 10 years' time? They don't know that. They personally, I think that the whole thing started because, I mean, my family, my grandfather manufactured electric motors, so I've got nothing against electric motors, and I think they started off with a promotion for electric motors. It was, let's sell more electric motors. Oh, look how combustion engines pollute the earth. And I think it caught on because we'd all agree, I don't want pollution in the earth. I don't think we should be putting any pollution in the earth. But to suggest that we could get rid of combustion engines by 2030, I mean, admittedly, you could keep your old ones until such time, but there's no way. How are you going to get rid of the combustion engine in South America? How are you going to get rid of the combustion engine in Africa? What about Asia? How are you going to get rid of all those combustion engines by 2030? You're not. And so this is really an attempt on the left to undermine. They can't win elections, so now they're trying to undermine people's belief in Western civilization. Now, I noticed that Boris, who I like, and I've got no problems with him at all, but he said, you know, we're talking about a scenario of the fall of Roman civilization. Well, yeah, I have to say Boris studied Greek history, not Roman, and I studied Roman history, as it happens. And the Roman Empire didn't fall. It actually moved to Constantinople. So it's not a very good analogy. But why would he say it anyway? What is the pressure being put on him? And I admit, in frontline politicians, they do have pressure put on them. There's no doubt about that. That's why I would never be an elected politician. I'm not prepared to say things that I don't believe. And politicians do have to say those things. I think that's why Boris sometimes gets accused of lying, because, oh, my ears were. Because it's just in the nature of things that if you're a politician, you've got to keep both sides of the party. I mean, 30% of both sides of the party line happy. 30% of people will never win an election, but that doesn't mean you can ignore them. You've got to kind of smooth things over. So you've got to kind of pander to their views. For example, in the red wall seats, there are people who used to vote Labour. You've got to give their views. Oh, something come up. But the whole idea that there's going to be some kind of civilizational catastrophe and the whole world is going to come to an end if we don't keep the climate at 1.5 is simply groupthink. They're all agreeing with each other. This was the case, David Cameron admitted, the banking crisis in 2008 was the result of groupthink. Jeremy Hunt admitted that their failure to test for a coronavirus, instead they did flu. The Sigma, wasn't it called Operation Sigma? He admitted that was groupthink. So I'm not saying anything controversial here. I'm saying that this is groupthink and that they've all come to the decision without allowing any oppositional views, such as mine. I mean, if you read the science just alone about volcanoes, they don't know. There is no science. I mean, I am a scientist. I believe in science. Hypothesis, experiment, inference, whatever you want to call it. Usually inference, not deduction. I've got no problem. But this is simply somebody pushing an idea for some personal or lobby reason or another. And if you look at it all, whether it's gender fluidity, whether it's the climate change, all of this stuff, it always ends up that you find it's anti-capitalist. And where you find the root of that problem is in postmodernism. It's called postmodernism. Look it up. I mean, one of the great things about internet and mobile phones is you can look this stuff up immediately. You know, you don't have to believe me. Look it up. Postmodernism, critical theory, critical race theory. That you don't know you're a racist. If you don't know you're a racist, then you must be a racist. If you say you're not a racist, then you must be a racist. Yeah, right. You know, I've never been a racist, and I'm not a racist. And I used to be in the Imperial Corps, you know, at St Albans School. That didn't mean I went around. In fact, why I left the Imperial Corps was because somebody once said, well, you'll have to shoot Irishmen. Well, I'm not going to shoot Irish people. I mean, they're my friends, and there was a political solution, and we found one. So all these sort of catastrophe stories coming up in the media, I think are quite. I think they're quite seditious. I think they're pernicious. They're deliberately trying to put into the minds of people that, I mean, for example, with Brexit, and I'm number one Brexiteer. All throughout European history, they come up with Napoleonic ideas. So they've always, the EU was a Napoleonic idea. Hitler's mad ideas for this, Stalin's mad ideas for that. And the English have never been like that. We're always extremely skeptical. And I want to maintain that line of skepticism. I simply do not believe. I think it's an act of arrogance on some humans to believe that A, we could change the climate to that extent, and B, we could even change it back. I mean, if they're saying we changed it back, and they completely ignore all the other factors. For example, CO2 isn't a pollutant. There would be no life on Earth without CO2. And they talk about it as if it's a pollutant. If those volcanoes hadn't stuffed CO2 into the atmosphere, there would be no life on Earth. It goes on. For example, can anyone remember when there was no fizzy, no CO2 for beers? Because that American fertilizer company had stopped making CO2. They'd shut down.
When was that?
It was about 5, 6 weeks ago, 7 weeks ago, 8 weeks ago. I must admit, I'm losing touch with time these days. It was recently.
All right.
And yeah, it was in the news. CF Fertilizers, it's called. You can check it out. I did before I came on air. If they can capture the CO2 in the manufacture of ammonia, which is what they do because it makes so-called blue fertilizers, they've got no CO2 in them. If they can capture the CO2, why can't all these big factories and all the others capture their CO2? How's that not? Why is that such a problem? They say it can't be done when this company obviously has done it because it sells CO2 to the fizzy drinks, beers, fizzy drinks. I think it's used in cooling meats and stuff like that. So, I mean, for example, what about that petrol shortage? Turned into a catastrophe. Oh, we're going to run. No, it wasn't. It was a demand thing. And so I'm very concerned because the corporations took the side of the postmodernists, because if you remember the 2008 financial crash, right? And there was an organization called Occupy Wall Street.
Right, go on, yeah.
What I heard was, or a story I heard, was that in fact the banks, because they didn't want any of the hassle caused by all this, they just started agreeing with them. So that large organizations, which are basically banks in the end, they just started accepting all these theories about, political correctness and wokeism and, gender fluidity, and I don't know, all these theories that they've got, because they didn't want the hassle. And so that you've got this huge, well, I wouldn't say huge, I mean, this large minority group that realize that socialism doesn't work and but they are anti-capitalist. And remember, corporations are not capitalists, they're corporate. And somebody else said this on the news lately. I thought that's the first time I've heard them. It's what my book is all about. Capitalism is about shopkeeping and small businesses. Corporatism is about these huge, whacking great companies that mass produce. You sometimes need them, but you don't have to have lots and lots and lots of them. But that's the way things are turning out. And it creates this corporate mindset, which is like groupthink, where if they want to believe something, you have to agree with them or you're cancelled. For example, I accept that these people can say they believe that there's going to be a catastrophe, right? You know, if you believe there's going to be some kind of climate catastrophe, that's your right. You can believe that. But I also believe there isn't. And the difference is that capitalists, or whatever you want to call us, capitalists will allow you to believe what you want to believe. But the postmodernists will not allow you to believe what you want to believe, which of course is classic Marxist and socialism theory. You've got to believe what they say. You can't start having your own thoughts. They don't like individualism. I don't think there's going to be a climate catastrophe. I don't think there's going to. I think they're just trying to get rid of fossil fuels. Why? I mean, I'm not saying I want to pollute the earth. If you want to have, lots of people can have electric cars. That will reduce the amount of. But you're never going to get rid of the need for gas for heating.
No.
You're never going to get rid of the need for oil for some things. Are you going to turn all shipping into electric ships in 30 years?
No, it's going to be battery.
Eh?
It's going to be battery. They're going to have these stations out in the sea where you charge them up.
Yeah. Do you realize? I mean, I think a lot of the people are Marxists in the postmodernists who want to get rid of oil because they think that every single war, certainly since the discovery of oil, has been about oil. And I mean, there's an element of truth in it. But what about the lithium?
Yeah.
You've got to get lithium. I can't remember if it's Bolivia or Peru. It's one of the other, but I think it's Peru or Chile. It's one of those three. I've forgotten now. But there's this huge lake. They've got this huge lake in this South American country. And you look at it and think it's actually a massive lake of lithium. It's one of the biggest sites of lithium in the world. And as we now know, there's a big one in Afghanistan. They're going to be fighting over lithium.
Well, Robert, thank you so much for coming on. That has been really interesting. And you kept me on my toes trying to find out information so I can put on here. Some of it was, I don't know. But anyway, if it helps, it helps. But Robert, thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
Next week.
See you next week. Thanks very much. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Welcomed.
Yeah.
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 What did you have for dinner?
Fish and chips, of course.
Alright. Can you pick me up in an hour?
In an hour?